Cops plant evidence against a black woman. Her lawyer's surprise in court leaves them speechless. One routine traffic stop. That's all it took for an innocent woman's life to spiral out of control. A teacher, known for her kindness and dedication, suddenly finds herself accused of a crime so outrageous it defies belief. But here's the twist. This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. What if the evidence was planted? What if those sworn to serve and protect were the ones pulling the strings? What unfolded in the courtroom left everyone speechless, and when the truth finally came out, it sent shock waves far beyond the case. This is a story of corruption, resilience, and justice, but it doesn't end how you think. The night air in Atlanta felt thick and heavy as Sarah Jenkins drove home from her volunteer shift at the Beacon Youth Center. Her favorite jazz playlist filled the car, a soothing balm after a long day mentoring kids who reminded her of the struggles she'd overcome herself. She had stayed later than usual, helping a young boy write a speech for his school's talent show. The center had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could give back and make a difference. Sarah glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It read 10:47 p.m. The streets were quiet, with only the faint hum of street lights and the occasional car passing by. She sighed, already thinking about the stack of ungraded essays waiting on her dining table. As a middle school teacher, her work never truly ended. Out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights erupted behind her, breaking the peace of the night. The shrill sound of a police siren pierced through her car's speakers, jarring her out of her thoughts. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat as she checked her rearview mirror. A police cruiser was tailing her, its lights demanding her to pull over. She immediately signaled and pulled to the side of the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her mind raced as she tried to recall if she had done anything wrong. Speeding? No. Broken taillight? No. I just got my car serviced last month. The officer's spotlight illuminated her car, casting harsh shadows inside. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself of what she had always told the kids at the youth center. Stay calm, be respectful, comply. She reached for her purse, slowly pulling out her driver's license and registration. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, just like her father had taught her years ago. A tall, stocky white officer approached her car on the driver's side. His face was partially obscured by the blinding light from his flashlight, which he aimed directly at her eyes. Behind him, another officer lingered near the cruiser, his hand resting ominously on his holstered gun. License and registration. The officer barked, his tone sharp and cold. Sarah complied immediately, handing over the documents without a word. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice steady, though her chest felt tight with unease. The officer glanced at her license, then looked back at her, his eyes narrowing. "Step out of the car," he ordered, ignoring her question. Sarah froze. "Step out of the car? May I ask why?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Step out of the car, ma'am." "Now," he repeated, his tone more forceful this time. Her pulse quickened, but she nodded and unbuckled her seatbelt. She opened the door and stepped out onto the pavement, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The second officer, younger and leaner, walked over and stood a few feet away, his hand still on his gun. The tension in the air was palpable. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," the first officer ordered. Sarah hesitated, confusion etched across her face. "What's going on? I don't understand." "Hands on the hood," he barked, cutting her off. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She placed her hands on the hood of her car, feeling the heat radiating from the engine. The officer patted her down roughly, his actions void of any explanation or courtesy. She flinched as his hand brushed against her side. "What are you looking for?" "I don't have anything," she protested, her voice breaking. Her fear was quickly being replaced by indignation. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he motioned to the younger cop, who began searching her car without asking for her consent. Sarah craned her neck to look back, but the first officer pressed her shoulders down. "Stay still," he growled. Minutes felt like hours as she stood there, helpless, while the younger officer rummaged through her belongings. He opened her glove compartment, her bag, even the small pouch where she kept spare change. Sarah could hear the sound of zippers and papers being shuffled, each noise a violation of her privacy. Then the younger officer emerged from the car, holding a small, clear plastic bag filled with white powder. Sarah's stomach dropped. "Found it," he said smugly, holding it up for the other officer to see. Sarah's mouth fell open in shock. What? That's not mine. I've never seen that before, she cried, turning around to face them despite the first officer's attempt to restrain her. The older officer grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance, he said, his voice void of emotion. No, this is a mistake. I don't do drugs. I've never. Sarah's protests were cut off as the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Tears blurred her vision as the officers dragged her toward their cruiser. The younger cop smirked. Tell it to the judge, he said, slamming the back door shut once Sarah was shoved inside. As the cruiser pulled away, Sarah stared out the window, her mind racing with a mix of fear and disbelief. How could this be happening? She had done everything right, followed every rule, and still, her life was unraveling in a matter of minutes. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of her fight for justice. The cold, hard bench in the holding cell offered little comfort. Sarah Jenkins sat there, her hands trembling and her wrists sore from the tight handcuffs that had only recently been removed. Her mind swirled with disbelief, fear, and anger as she tried to process the events of the past few hours. The small, dimly lit cell smelled of bleach and despair. The walls were scuffed and covered in faint graffiti, remnants of the countless lives that had passed through this place before her. A single flickering fluorescent bulb above cast harsh shadows that danced across her face. She pulled her knees up to her chest, hugging them tightly, as if to shield herself from the reality of her surroundings. It was past midnight now, but sleep was out of the question. Her mind replayed every moment of the arrest, searching for answers that wouldn't come. The younger officer's smirk haunted her thoughts, his casual cruelty, the way he had tossed that bag of drugs into evidence, as if it were just another routine day. It made her stomach churn. The door at the far end of the hallway buzzed loudly, breaking the silence. Sarah's heart leapt in her chest as she heard the approaching footsteps of an officer. She straightened her back and wiped her damp cheeks, determined not to show weakness. The heavy metal door to her cell creaked open, revealing a female officer with a clipboard in hand. Sarah Jenkins? The woman asked, her tone clipped and devoid of warmth. Sarah nodded, rising slowly to her feet. Her legs felt shaky, but she willed them to steady. Your bail's been posted. Let's go, the officer said, motioning for her to follow. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't even been given the chance to make a call. Who could have posted her bail? Questions swirled in her mind as she stepped out of the cell, her every movement feeling surreal. The officer led her down a long corridor toward the release area. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, each step heightening Sarah's anxiety. When they reached the front desk, she saw a familiar figure standing there. James Miller, the civil rights lawyer who had once spoken at the youth center where Sarah volunteered. James, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking as she approached him. Relief washed over her like a wave, but it was quickly followed by confusion. How did you know? James turned to her, his expression calm but serious. His tailored suit was slightly rumpled, and his tie hung loose around his neck, a sign of the late hour. A mutual friend at the youth center called me as soon as they heard about your arrest. They said it didn't add up, and I agreed. His sharp brown eyes softened as he looked at her. I'm here to help, Sarah. Her lip quivered as she fought back tears. For the first time since her arrest, she felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice barely audible. James nodded, his demeanor professional yet kind. Let's get out of here first. We'll talk more once you've had a chance to collect yourself. James's car was a sleek black sedan, its interior immaculate and quiet. The ride back to Sarah's apartment was tense, but filled with a strange sense of safety. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Sarah stared out the window, watching the empty streets of Atlanta blur past. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her chest like a physical force. Finally, James broke the silence. Sarah, I've seen cases like this before. Cops planting evidence to justify an arrest. It's more common than you'd think, especially for people of color. Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. But, why me? I've never even had a parking ticket. I'm a teacher. I work with kids. Why would they do this? James sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Because it's easy. They stop you late at night, say they smelled something suspicious, search your car, and suddenly they have a case. You're a black woman driving alone. It's enough for them to think they can get away with it. His words felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah had always known about systemic racism, had taught her students about the importance of standing up against injustice. But to become a target of it herself, it was a reality she hadn't prepared for. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Now we fight. I'll file a motion to dismiss the charges based on lack of evidence and misconduct. But it won't be easy. Cases like this rely on the system protecting its own, especially when it comes to law enforcement." Sarah's stomach sank. "So there's a chance I could still be convicted, even though I didn't do anything?" James's jaw tightened. "We'll do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. But I need you to be ready, Sarah. This fight might get ugly." She nodded, her resolve hardening despite the fear gnawing at her. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said firmly. When they arrived at Sarah's apartment, the small, familiar space felt both comforting and suffocating. The pile of ungraded essays still sat on the dining table, a stark reminder of the life that had been abruptly put on hold. She set her bag down on the couch and turned to James. "Do you really think we have a chance?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. James looked her straight in the eye, his expression unwavering. "Sarah, the truth is on our side. And I've made a career out of fighting for people like you. We're not just going to prove your innocence. We're going to expose what they did." Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe that justice might still be possible. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning of a battle that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The following morning, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of untouched coffee. The pale light of dawn filtered through the blinds, casting long, uneven shadows across the room. Her apartment, usually a space of warmth and calm, felt strangely foreign now, as if the events of the previous night had tainted its sanctity. The stack of ungraded essays still sat on the table, a silent reminder of her interrupted routine. Her students would be in class today, oblivious to the fact that their teacher was now caught in a legal nightmare. The thought of their curious faces, their chatter about weekend plans and school projects, brought a pang of sadness to her chest. A sharp knock on the door startled her. Her heart raced as she rose from her chair, the unease from the night before still clinging to her like a second skin. Peering through the peephole, she saw James Miller standing in the hallway, a leather briefcase in hand and a determined look on his face. She opened the door, forcing a small smile. "James, come in." He stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his tone gentle but purposeful. "I hope you managed to get some rest." She shook her head, closing the door behind him. "Not much. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing their faces, the cops, the way they looked at me like I was nothing." James set his briefcase on the table and took a seat. "I understand. Unfortunately, that's exactly what they want, to intimidate you, to make you feel small. But we're not going to let them win." Sarah sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "So what happens now? What's the next step?" James opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of neatly organized papers. "I spent the early hours reviewing the police report and their so-called evidence. There are several glaring inconsistencies already." Sarah leaned forward, her brows furrowed. "Like what?" James flipped through the report, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow. "First, the timeline. According to the officers, they stopped you because they observed erratic driving. But the traffic camera footage from the intersection where they claimed to have seen you doesn't support that. You were driving normally." He turned the page. "Second, the evidence. The report states that the bag of cocaine was found in your glove compartment, but there's no mention of a search warrant. Without your consent or probable cause, that search was illegal." Sarah's eyes widened. "Doesn't that mean the evidence can't be used against me?" "In theory, yes," James said, nodding. "But the system doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. That's why we have to be meticulous. I'll be filing a motion to suppress the evidence, but we need more than that. We need to dismantle their case entirely." James pulled out a notepad and pen, his expression thoughtful. "I need to know everything about what happened before, during, and after the arrest. Every detail matters." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to the events of the previous night. "I was driving home from the youth center. It was late, around 10:30. I wasn't speeding or anything. The police car just appeared out of nowhere and pulled me over." James nodded, jotting down notes. "Did they tell you why they stopped you?" "They said I was driving erratically, but that's not true. Sarah said, her voice firm. I wasn't swerving or anything like that. And the search? James asked. Did you give them permission? No, Sarah said emphatically. I asked why they wanted me to step out of the car, but they wouldn't tell me. They just ordered me to do it. Then one of them searched my car while the other kept me by the hood. James's pen moved swiftly across the page. Did you see them find the drugs? Sarah shook her head, her eyes narrowing in anger. No, they didn't pull anything out until after they'd been searching for a while. And when they showed me the bag, I told them it wasn't mine. I don't even know where it came from. James looked up at her, his expression serious. This is important, Sarah. Did either of the officers say anything that stood out? Anything unusual? She paused, thinking hard. The younger officer, he smirked at me when they put me in the back of the car. He said, "Tell it to the judge." It felt like he knew this was all a setup. James's jaw tightened. That's exactly what it was, a setup. And we're going to prove it. James leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. There's one more thing we need to address, body cam footage. Sarah's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. Do you think they were wearing body cams? They're supposed to be, James said. It's department policy. If they weren't, that's a violation. And if they were, the footage could either prove their case or ours. My job is to make sure we get access to it. Sarah nodded, a spark of determination igniting within her. How do we do that? I'll file a subpoena for the body cam footage and any related documentation, like dispatch logs and the chain of custody for the evidence. If they try to withhold or tamper with anything, that'll only strengthen our case. James closed his briefcase, his eyes meeting Sarah's. This is going to be a long fight, Sarah, but I need you to trust me. We're not just going to defend you. We're going to hold them accountable. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists. I trust you, and I'm not going to let them ruin my life without a fight. As James stood to leave, Sarah followed him to the door. The fear that had gripped her since the arrest was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else, a flicker of hope, a spark of resilience. When the door closed behind him, Sarah stood in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of the battle ahead settling on her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't face it passively. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about justice for herself, for her community, for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. The hum of the courthouse air conditioning was the only sound Sarah could focus on as she sat in the small, sterile room where James had asked her to meet him. The walls were an institutional beige, the kind of color that seemed to mute emotions. A single window let in a gray stream of daylight, but it did little to soften the tension that coiled in Sarah's chest. She sat at the edge of her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. In front of her was a stack of documents James had asked her to review, affidavits, witness statements, and the official police report. She had read through it 3 times already, but each time her anger flared anew. Every word in that report felt like a lie, a deliberate twisting of reality to fit a false narrative. They're treating me like I'm disposable, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible. Like my life doesn't matter. The sound of the door opening made her sit up straighter. James walked in, his briefcase in one hand and a folder in the other. His expression was serious but calm, the kind of calm that carried the weight of preparation. He gave her a brief nod and placed the folder on the table as he sat across from her. Sorry I'm late, he said, his voice steady but low. I just came from a meeting with the prosecutor. Sarah stiffened. The prosecutor? Did they say anything? James leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he looked at her. They're confident. Too confident, if you ask me. They're banking on the officer's testimony and the evidence they claim to have. They're convinced it's enough for a conviction. Her stomach twisted, but she held his gaze. And what do you think? I think their confidence is misplaced, he said, his tone unwavering. But we need to be strategic. This isn't just about proving your innocence. It's about dismantling their case piece by piece. He opened the folder, spreading out several documents and photographs. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes scanning the material. One of the photographs caught her attention, a blurry image of her car taken from what appeared to be a dashboard camera. This is from the police cruiser, James explained. It's part of the evidence they submitted. But there's something off about it. Sarah squinted at the photo, trying to see what he meant. What do you mean? James tapped the edge of the photograph. Look at the timestamp. It's missing. Every dash cam recording is supposed to include a timestamp to verify when the footage was taken. Without it, This could have been recorded at any time. Sarah's eyes widened. So it's not real evidence. It's evidence, James clarified, but it's unreliable. And unreliable evidence can't hold up in court if we argue it properly. He pushed another document toward her, a copy of the police report. Now look at this. The officers claim they stopped you for erratic driving, but there's no mention of a specific traffic violation. It's vague, too vague to justify a stop. Sarah nodded slowly, her anger simmering beneath her skin. They didn't even tell me why they stopped me until after they searched my car. It was like they knew they'd find something or plant something. James's expression darkened. And that brings us to the evidence itself, the cocaine. I've already filed a motion to challenge the chain of custody. If we can prove it wasn't handled properly, it could be thrown out. He paused, studying her face. Sarah, I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to be ready for what's coming. The prosecutor is going to try to paint you as guilty before we even get a chance to speak. They'll use your silence, your fear, anything they can to sway the jury. Her jaw tightened, and she straightened her posture. I won't let them. I'll do whatever it takes to clear my name. James gave her a small, approving nod. Good. Because there's something else I need to tell you. James hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to continue. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. I've been digging into the officers involved, Brian Scott and Kevin Moore. Scott, in particular, has a history. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A history? James nodded, sliding another document toward her. There are multiple complaints against him. Excessive force, racial profiling, even allegations of planting evidence. Most of them were dismissed without investigation, but it shows a pattern. Her hands curled into fists as she read through the document. The complaints were chilling, each one a story of someone else who had likely been in her position, people who had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. Why is he still a cop? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Because the system protects its own, James said bluntly. But this is where we can hit them hard. If we can establish a pattern of misconduct, it undermines his credibility. It won't just be your word against his. It'll be his word against his own record. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. How do we prove that? How do we make the court listen? James's lips pressed into a thin line. It won't be easy, but I've already reached out to some of the people who filed complaints against Scott. If they're willing to testify, it could change everything. As the meeting went on, Sarah felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on her shoulders. Every step forward seemed to reveal a new layer of complexity, a new challenge to overcome. But for the first time since her arrest, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, flickering light in the darkness. When the meeting ended, James gathered his papers and stood. We'll regroup in a few days. In the meantime, try to get some rest. You're going to need your strength. Sarah walked him to the door, her mind still reeling. James, she said softly as he turned to leave. He paused, looking at her expectantly. Thank you. For believing me. For fighting for me. His expression softened, and he gave her a small, reassuring smile. The truth is worth fighting for, Sarah. Always. As the door closed behind him, Sarah stood in the silence of her apartment, the documents still spread out on the table. She didn't feel like the same person she had been just days ago. Something inside her had shifted, an awakening, a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been wrongfully accused, every person who had been silenced by a corrupt system. And she wouldn't stop until the truth came to light. Sarah arrived at the courthouse early, her heart thudding in her chest like a distant drumbeat. The imposing gray building stood tall before her, its stone columns etched with years of history. Today was the preliminary hearing, the first real step in the battle to clear her name. The morning air was crisp, but Sarah barely noticed as she climbed the wide stone steps, her shoes tapping softly against the cool surface. She clutched her bag tightly, her knuckles white, as she held onto it like a lifeline. Inside was everything she thought she might need: a notebook to take notes, a water bottle, and the small silver cross her grandmother had given her when she graduated college. It wasn't for faith, exactly, but for comfort. The weight of it in her hand reminded her that she came from strong women who had faced challenges far greater than this. James was waiting for her at the top of the steps, a file tucked under his arm, and his expression calm but focused. His suit was impeccably tailored, a subtle navy blue that exuded confidence without being ostentatious. When he saw her approach, He offered a reassuring smile. "You're here early," he said, his voice warm but low. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I couldn't stay home. Sitting there waiting, it's worse than being here." James nodded in understanding. "That's normal. But remember, Sarah, today isn't about them proving anything. It's about showing the judge there's enough to go to trial. And we're going to use this hearing to start poking holes in their case." She exhaled slowly, trying to let his words sink in. "Do you think the judge will see through it?" James's jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Judge Coleman is fair. She has a reputation for being thorough and not tolerating any nonsense. That's why this hearing is important. It's our chance to show her the cracks in their story." Sarah nodded, trying to absorb his confidence as her own. But the weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just walking into a courtroom. She was stepping into a battlefield. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had imagined. The wooden pews for spectators were polished but worn, their surfaces gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish, a strange combination that seemed to cling to the walls. She followed James to the defendant's table, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The prosecutor, Brenda Davis, a sharp-featured woman with a severe bun, was already seated at the opposite table. She glanced at Sarah briefly, her expression cool and detached, before returning her attention to the files in front of her. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. This woman didn't see her as a person, just a case, a file, a name on a docket. James leaned over and whispered, "That's Brenda Davis. She's aggressive, but don't let her demeanor rattle you. She's here to win, but so are we." Sarah nodded, though her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, as though even the walls were watching her. A door opened at the front of the room, and Judge Laura Coleman entered, her black robe flowing behind her like a shadow. She took her seat behind the elevated bench, her presence commanding respect without needing to demand it. Her dark eyes swept over the room before settling on the prosecutor. "Ms. Davis, you may begin," the judge said, her voice steady and deliberate. Brenda Davis stood, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached the podium. She launched into her opening statement, her tone clipped and authoritative, as she painted Sarah as a suspicious individual whose actions warranted police intervention. Every word felt like a stab, each sentence carefully crafted to chip away at Sarah's character. Sarah kept her eyes forward, her face impassive, but inside, her anger simmered. The lies spilled so easily from the prosecutor's mouth, as if Sarah's life was nothing more than a narrative to manipulate. When it was James's turn to speak, the atmosphere shifted. He stood with a calm confidence, his voice measured but firm. He began by addressing the weaknesses in the prosecution's argument, questioning the legitimacy of the evidence and the motives of the officers involved. "This case isn't about justice," James said, his voice resonating through the room. "It's about power and abuse. My client is an innocent woman who has been targeted and victimized by officers who thought they could get away with misconduct." Sarah watched the judge closely, searching for any flicker of reaction in her expression. But Judge Coleman's face remained neutral, her pen moving occasionally as she jotted down notes. The first witness called was Officer Brian Scott. Sarah felt her stomach twist as he approached the stand, his uniform crisp and his demeanor confident. He spoke with practiced ease, detailing the events of the night in question as though he were reciting a well-rehearsed script. James stood to cross-examine him, his expression unreadable. "Officer Scott, you stated in your report that you stopped Ms. Jenkins for erratic driving. Can you specify what constituted erratic in this instance?" Scott hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Sarah to notice. "She was swerving slightly within her lane," he said, his tone even. James nodded, his face calm. "And did you record this swerving on your dash cam?" Scott's jaw tightened. The dash cam didn't capture it clearly. James tilted his head slightly, as if considering the answer. "So there's no visual evidence of this alleged erratic driving? Is that correct?" Scott shifted in his seat. "Correct." James stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly, forcing the room to hang on his words. "And yet you proceeded to search her vehicle without a warrant or her consent. Can you explain why?" Scott's confidence faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "We had reasonable suspicion." "Reasonable suspicion," James repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. Suspicion based on what, exactly? A hunch? A gut feeling? The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah's pulse quickened as she watched the officer struggle to maintain his composure. For the first time, she felt the tide begin to shift, however slightly. By the time the hearing adjourned for the day, Sarah felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. James had managed to plant seeds of doubt in the prosecution's case, exposing cracks in the foundation they had built. But she knew this was only the beginning. As she stepped outside into the crisp evening air, Sarah took a deep breath, letting the coolness fill her lungs. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time, she felt the faintest glimmer of something she hadn't felt in days: strength. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the dimly lit office where James Miller sat, meticulously combing through a stack of documents. The courthouse's preliminary hearing had gone as expected, planted doubt, exposed weak points. But James knew this was far from over. The prosecution wasn't going to back down without a fight, and neither were the officers who had built their story around lies. In the center of his desk sat the police report, the dashcam footage, and the motions he'd filed earlier that day. But what held his focus now were the complaints against Officer Brian Scott, stretching back nearly a decade. Sarah's case wasn't the first time this officer's name had come up in allegations of misconduct, and James was determined to prove it wouldn't be the last. The office door creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside, her movements tentative. She had agreed to meet James late in the evening, unable to sit still in her apartment as the weight of the case consumed her. She wore a simple cardigan over jeans, her posture rigid, betraying her inner turmoil. "You're still working?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with exhaustion. James glanced up, offering a small smile. "I'm always working when it matters. Come in, have a seat." Sarah hesitated before crossing the room and lowering herself into the chair opposite his desk. Her eyes darted toward the papers spread across the surface. "What are those?" James leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. Records of prior complaints against Officer Scott. Excessive force, racial profiling, tampering with evidence. Most of these were either dismissed or quietly settled out of court. Sarah frowned, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. If there are so many complaints, why is he still on the force? How can they let him get away with this? The following day, Sarah accompanied James to a local diner, a humble place on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of spot where regulars sipped coffee at the counter while soft rock played on the jukebox in the corner. But today, it was their meeting place for a critical step in the case. James had tracked down Maria Evans, a single mother who had filed a complaint against Officer Scott 2 years earlier. Maria's case had been eerily similar to Sarah's: an unwarranted stop, planted evidence, and a subsequent arrest that turned her life upside down. Her case had been dismissed when she couldn't afford proper legal representation, leaving her record tarnished and her trust in the justice system shattered. Maria arrived, her eyes wary as she slid into the booth across from Sarah and James. She was petite, with tired eyes and a nervous energy that made her fingers fidget with the edge of her jacket. "Ms. Evans, thank you for meeting us," James began, his tone calm and respectful. "I know this must be difficult, but your story could be crucial in helping us expose Officer Scott's misconduct." Maria glanced at Sarah, her expression conflicted. "I don't know if I can do this. Last time, I tried to stand up for myself, and it only made things worse. I lost my job. My son, he still asks why the police think I'm a bad person." Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface. "I know how you feel. I'm living it right now. But if we don't fight back, he'll keep doing this to other people. People like us." Maria's eyes flickered with a glimmer of understanding. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" James explained the process, outlining how her testimony could help establish a pattern of behavior that would undermine the prosecution's case. As he spoke, Sarah watched Maria's face shift from fear to determination, as if the weight of her past was finally giving way to a chance for redemption. By the end of the meeting, Maria had agreed to testify. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, the silence pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She stared at her phone, scrolling through news articles about wrongful convictions and police misconduct. Each story felt like a mirror, reflecting the same themes of injustice and despair. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Her heart leapt in her chest as she stood, hesitating for a moment before peering through the peephole. It was James. She opened the door, her brow furrowed. "James, what are you doing here so late?" He stepped inside, his expression serious. "I wanted to give you this in person." He handed her a sealed envelope. Sarah took it, her fingers brushing against the smooth paper. "What is it?" "It's a copy of the subpoena I filed for the body cam footage," James explained. "The court approved it. We're going to get our hands on the footage." Sarah's breath hitched. "Do you think it'll show what really happened?" James nodded. "If they didn't tamper with it, yes. And if they did, well, that's a whole different can of worms we can use to our advantage." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a small, genuine smile tug at her lips. "Thank you, James, for everything." He met her gaze, his voice firm. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a long road ahead, but we're getting closer to the truth." As he left, Sarah stood in the doorway, clutching the envelope tightly. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that justice might be within reach. And as she closed the door and turned back to her quiet apartment, Sarah whispered to herself, "I won't let them break me." The envelope sat on Sarah's coffee table like an unopened portal to the truth. She had stared at it for what felt like hours, unable to bring herself to touch it again since James handed it to her. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a key to everything. The night that had turned her life upside down, the lies that had bound her into this nightmare, the proof of what really happened. And yet, the thought of what the footage might reveal sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm mug of tea she'd made earlier, its heat grounding her in the stillness of her living room. Her apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of traffic outside. Every second stretched into eternity, and the weight of the fight ahead pressed heavily on her chest. She finally picked up her phone and called James. He answered after the second ring, his voice calm and steady. "Sarah? Everything okay?" She hesitated, staring at the envelope as though it might speak to her. "James, do you have the footage? Did you already get it?" "I just received it," he said. "It came in late this afternoon. I was planning to go through it tonight." Sarah's fingers tightened around her phone. "Can I come? I don't think I can sit here alone, waiting to know." There was a brief pause on the other end before James spoke. "Of course. Come by the office. I'll be here." James's office felt different at night. The glow of a single desk lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the bookshelves and filing cabinets. Sarah stepped inside, feeling the quiet weight of the space as she set her bag down on the chair beside her. James sat behind his desk, a laptop open in front of him. On the screen was the first frame of the body cam footage, frozen in place. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice measured but gentle. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded, though her hands were trembling. "As ready as I'll ever be." James pressed play. The footage began with the view from Officer Scott's body cam. The timestamp was intact, matching the time of Sarah's stop. The initial seconds showed Scott pulling up behind Sarah's car, his voice coming through the audio as he called in the stop to dispatch. His tone was casual, almost bored, as though this were just another routine stop. Sarah leaned forward, her breath hitching as she saw herself in the driver's seat, signaling and pulling over. The footage captured every detail, her careful movements, her visible compliance. She watched herself lower the window and hand over her license and registration, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness as she asked why she had been stopped. Scott's voice was cold and dismissive as he ordered her out of the car without explanation. Sarah's jaw tightened as she remembered the fear that had gripped her in that moment, now relived in stark detail. Then came the critical part. The footage showed Scott patting her down near the hood of the car, while Officer Kevin Moore began searching the vehicle. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched, her body tense, as if she were back in that moment. And then it happened. In the corner of the frame, barely noticeable at first, Moore could be seen pulling something from his pocket, a small plastic bag. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched him casually place it in her glove compartment before calling out, "Found it." James paused the footage, his expression grim. "There it is," he said quietly, clear as day. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. They just planted it like it was nothing? Like my life didn't matter?" James nodded, his jaw tight with anger. "This is exactly what we needed. This footage doesn't just prove your innocence. It exposes their corruption. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched the screen, the image frozen on Officer Moore's damning action. But will it be enough? Will the court believe it? James turned to her, his gaze firm. Sarah, this footage is a smoking gun. It's undeniable, and we're not going to stop until everyone sees it. Sarah leaned back in her chair, the emotions crashing over her like waves. Relief, anger, disbelief. They all swirled within her, threatening to overwhelm her. For days, she had been trapped in the uncertainty of her own reality, questioning how something so unjust could happen to her. Now the truth was laid bare, but the fight was far from over. What happens next? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James closed the laptop, the weight of the moment reflected in his eyes. We file a motion to introduce this footage into evidence. It's going to force the prosecution to rethink their case, and it puts the officers under scrutiny. They'll either try to discredit the footage or shift the blame, but we won't let them. Sarah nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. I want them to answer for this, James. Not just for me, but for everyone they've done this to. They will, he assured her. This footage is the beginning of the end for them. Later that night, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the city lights. The footage played over and over in her mind, each frame etched into her memory. She thought about the other names in James's file, the people who had been silenced, ignored, and dismissed. Her phone buzzed with a message from James. Rest tonight. We're going to win this. Sarah set the phone down and exhaled slowly, her hands resting on her lap. For the first time since her arrest, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for something greater. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting for the truth, for accountability, for justice. And as she lay down, the weight of the battle ahead still pressing heavily on her, Sarah whispered to herself in the dark, I won't let them get away with this. The morning sunlight spilled into Sarah's apartment, painting the walls in soft shades of gold. But the warmth of the light did little to soothe the chill that had settled in her chest. She sat at her dining table, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, staring at the stack of legal documents James had left with her the night before. The body cam footage had given her hope, but it had also left her with a gnawing sense of vulnerability. It was clear evidence of her innocence, yes, but it was also a harsh reminder of how easily her life had been thrown into chaos. A single lie, a planted bag of cocaine, and her entire existence had unraveled. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of her phone. She picked it up and saw James's name on the screen. She answered quickly, her voice a little unsteady. James. Good morning, Sarah, he said, his tone calm but purposeful. I've just filed the motion to admit the body cam footage into evidence. The court will review it, and the judge will make a decision on whether it can be used in trial. Sarah let out a slow breath. And do you think they'll allow it? It's hard to say, James admitted. The footage is damning for the officers, and the prosecution will do everything they can to discredit it. They might argue that it's incomplete or taken out of context. But we'll be ready for that. Sarah nodded, even though he couldn't see her. What do I need to do? For now, nothing, James said. But there's something else I want to discuss with you. The footage, it's powerful. And if we play this right, it could turn public opinion in your favor. Sarah frowned, her grip tightening on her phone. Public opinion? Yes, James said. I know you've been avoiding the media, and I understand why. But if we release the footage to the press, it could put pressure on the prosecution and the police department. It could force them to answer for what they've done. Sarah's stomach churned at the thought. The idea of her face on the news, her story dissected by strangers, it was overwhelming. James, I don't know if I'm ready for that. What if it backfires? What if people don't believe me? That's a risk, he admitted. But the footage speaks for itself, Sarah. It shows the truth. And right now, the truth is your greatest weapon. She hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. The thought of stepping into the public eye was terrifying, but she also knew James was right. The footage wasn't just her story. It was a spotlight on a broken system that needed to be held accountable. I need to think about it, she said finally. Of course, James said gently. Take your time. This is your decision, and I'll support you no matter what you choose. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her living room, the city lights twinkling outside her window. She had spent hours thinking about James's proposal, weighing the risks and rewards. The fear of public scrutiny was real, but so was the potential for justice. She thought about Maria Evans, the woman who had agreed to testify against Officer Scott. She thought about the countless others whose voices had been silenced by corruption and fear. If she stayed quiet, if she let her fear control her, she would be just another name on that list. She picked up her phone and called James. He answered almost immediately. "Sarah," he said, "have you made a decision?" Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "Release the footage. Let the world see what they did." The footage went live the next morning. James had worked with a trusted journalist at the Atlanta Tribune, a local paper known for its investigative reporting. Within hours of the story breaking, it began to spread. The headline was blunt and powerful. Body cam footage exposes police corruption. Innocent woman targeted in shocking case. Sarah avoided the news at first, unable to face the storm she knew was brewing. But her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from friends, others from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Most were supportive, but a few were laced with doubt and skepticism. By the afternoon, the story had gained traction on social media. Hashtags like Justice for Sarah and police corruption began trending, while others accused her of fabricating the story for attention. It was a whirlwind of emotions, and Sarah found herself glued to her phone, scrolling through the comments despite herself. James called her in the early evening, his voice calm but energized. "Sarah, this is working. The footage is being picked up by national outlets. The pressure is mounting." Sarah sighed, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "And the backlash? There are people who still don't believe me." "There always will be," James said gently. "But the truth is out there now, and the more people see it, the harder it will be for them to deny it." The following day, the Atlanta Police Department held a press conference. Sarah watched it from her couch, her heart pounding as the police chief stood behind a podium, flanked by other officers. "We take these allegations very seriously," the chief said, his tone measured but defensive. "The actions depicted in the footage are deeply concerning, and an internal investigation has been launched. Both officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation." Sarah's chest tightened as she listened. Administrative leave? That was it. After everything they had done, after the lies, the planted evidence, the damage to her life, they were being allowed to walk away with a slap on the wrist? Her phone buzzed with a message from James. "This is just the beginning. Don't let this discourage you." In the days that followed, the tide began to turn. Public support for Sarah grew as more people watched the footage and saw the truth for themselves. Journalists began digging into Officer Scott's history, uncovering patterns of misconduct that mirrored Sarah's case. The spotlight was no longer just on her. It was on the entire system. But Sarah knew the real fight was still ahead. The court date loomed on the horizon, and while the body cam footage had changed the game, it hadn't ended it. She was still a defendant, still a woman fighting for her freedom and her dignity. As she sat at her kitchen table one night, reviewing notes for the trial, Sarah felt a quiet determination settle over her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the people who couldn't, for the voices that had been silenced, for the truth that deserved to be heard. And no matter how hard the road ahead might be, Sarah knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop. The day of the trial arrived with an unrelenting tension that Sarah couldn't shake. The courthouse buzzed with activity, reporters stationed outside, cameras poised for the moment she stepped through the doors. Sarah had never imagined herself at the center of such a public spectacle, but the body cam footage had made her case a flashpoint in the ongoing battle for justice and accountability. James met her at the courthouse steps, his expression calm but purposeful. He carried a black leather briefcase and wore a navy suit that projected confidence. "You ready?" he asked as they approached the throng of reporters. Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "As ready as I'll ever be." James nodded. "Let's make them hear the truth." The courtroom was packed with spectators filling the gallery and reporters lined up along the back. Judge Laura Coleman presided from her bench, her presence commanding and no nonsense. Sarah sat beside James at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the room, the prosecutor, Brenda Davis, reviewed her notes, a steely determination in her eyes. The trial began with the prosecution laying out their case, painting Sarah as a woman who had been caught red-handed with illegal substances. Brenda Davis emphasized the officer's credibility and presented the bag of cocaine as evidence. The jury listened intently, their expressions unreadable. When it was James's turn to respond, he stood with measured confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, What we have here is not a case of a guilty woman, but a case of a broken system. This isn't justice. It's a manipulation of truth by those sworn to uphold it. And today, we'll prove that.